all the time. So let's turn on our Bibles to Daniel chapter 8. Woohoo! I got to work in everything there. Let's see here. Get my backup recording on the move. Are we good? All in the house. Good to go. All right, guys. So tonight in Daniel chapter 8, we've got another vision. That's really, the end of this book is just vision after vision after vision. You might consider these appendices, like Daniel's like, I really ought to write down all the stuff that happened. And so he writes Daniel 1 to 6. And then after chapter 6, he's like, maybe I should interject my own visions. So he kind of finishes the story, and then he goes back and is like, okay, well, chapter 7 is his first vision. Chapter 8 is his next vision. Chapter 9 is another. So, he has these visions throughout the rest of the book. Chapter 9 is not really a vision. That was his prayer, and then the angel coming and talking to him. That's not like a vision with an interpretation like we're going to see tonight. We're actually going to finish up chapter 9 tonight too, because we're going to talk a little bit about the Antichrist and not the Antichrist, you might say, and we'll explain it as we go. So let us start off here. I am going to break up the chapter a little bit into two chunks where we're kind of going to do the first part of the vision, and then we'll interpret that part, and then we'll kind of back up into the second part of the vision and focus on that last character. So chapter 8, verse 1 says, in the third year, the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. Now, again, if you're a note taker, or maybe you're just a nerd and you're not afraid to share it, the third year of Belshazzar was 551 BC. Danny boy here is 69 years old. Again, this is Belshazzar. This is the guy from the writing on the wall, back up a few chapters. Now, something worth noting, and it depends on your translation, but in verse 1 where it says, a vision appeared to me, Daniel. Other translations, and I think a good translation could be said as, even me, Daniel. And I like how just maybe tonight it starts off with some application. That Daniel seems surprised that God is using him, that God is giving him these visions. Daniel seems a bit shocked. And I think it just shows the humility of Daniel, that he's surprised that God is using him. And I would just throw it out there that twofold. One is, if Daniel is surprised that God is using him, heaven forbid any of us are not surprised that God is using us. Like, well, obviously God uses me because but that's the thing is Daniel was a humble guy, and it's just, man, even me, like God, he appeared to me, God gave me a vision. But then again, I think in his humility, he recognizes that it was never about him in the first place. I think even using this morning's text and kind of main point, God's looking for the willing. Are you willing for me to use you? Are you willing to show up if I'm willing to show up? Are you willing? And I think that's us stepping out in faith, trusting that God will use us, then God will show up. And so, even me, Daniel. So here's this vision now. Verse 2 says, I saw in the vision, and so it happened while I was looking, that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Shushan is located about 230 miles, I guess you guys east is that way? That sounds right. 230 miles east of Babylon. So in a sense, the distance from Jerusalem over to Babylon, do that again, and you'll get over to Susa or Shushan. Now this is the capital, or it was the capital of Elam. It was a major city for Persia. I heard an interesting point. I was listening to Chuck Missler, just something, a side note. Elam. Well, we don't use Elam anymore. And the Bible has a lot of these old names. And quite often in Isaiah and Ezekiel and many of the prophetic books, they will mention nations not by their contemporary names, but they'll actually mention them by the names found of the table of nations way back in Genesis. So you're talking like Genesis 10, 11, 10. Table of Nations, 11's Tower of Babel. So Table of Nations, where it mentions the 70 nations that went out around the globe. So it gets confusing for us because it's like, well, they're talking about Basra, and it's like, well, Basra then got named Petra, and then Petra gets named. And so a lot of these cities and nations get their names changed all the time. But Elam is one of the more ancient names. And so anyway, but it's the area of Persia, and it's at this city of Shushan. It's where Esther lived. Just a fun fact. Queen Esther, that was where she was from. There is one of the oldest archaeological finds of ancient writing in great amount, the Code of Hammurabi. That was found about 100 years ago in this city of Shushan. And he's hanging out by this river Ulai, and it's actually not even necessarily a river. It's a 900-foot wide canal, man-made. I'm just kind of setting the scene. But the idea is he wasn't really there. It's like in this vision, he gets whisked over, and he's whisked over into Persian territory, essentially. So he's now into the area which is going to be part of Persia. And really, if you back up to Belshazzar, remember, he's having this vision before the kingdom of Babylon is overthrown. This is like a dozen years before Babylon's overthrown. Persia's still kind of a nobody. They really do pop up out of nowhere and get great prominence, and we're going to now read about that. Because it says in verse 3, I lifted my eyes and saw there, standing beside the river, was a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high. I think I'm just going to read straight on down to 8. The 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any who could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him. And there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great. But when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in its place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now, I could explain what all that means, but instead, let's just, like I said, I want to kind of tackle this stuff first. So let's jump to verse 20, because Gabriel comes to start explaining it all. And so verse 20, he said, the ram which you saw, having 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. That settles that. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. And the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. And as for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. So it's a very clear interpretation. And it's things like this where I don't understand how people sometimes, when you look at the vision of the statue, Nebuchadnezzar's vision, or the beast coming out of the water, when people say, well, one is Media, then one is Persia, and then one is, this pretty much makes it sense. We got one ram, and there's 2 horns, Media and Persia, they're together. And then there's this male goat. Now again, the idea, the ram's kind of normal. It's got 2 horns, but one's bigger. But the goat, specifically a he-goat, as our King James says, authorized King James, has a horn between its eyes. Now, that's a weird goat. That's not a normal-looking goat. Goats normally have, horns, but not one down. It's a unigoat, okay? So we got the unigoat. And then it has these 4 horns that come out of it. Now, let's back up. And now I'll explain it in greater detail, give us our little history lesson. Then we'll move on from this and start talking about the Antichrist and Antiochus Epiphanes. So backing up to verse 3, this is the cool stuff. It says that there was a ram. It had 2 horns, second half of verse 3. But one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. Media was a major fighting force. It was a big kingdom. Truly, when Nabopolassar, Nebi's dad, decided to, I'm going to make Babylon its own nation again, right? The Assyrians were in control. Nineveh, I'm backing us up a little bit here, right? Nabopolassar decides Babylon's going to be a nation again, and we're taking out Assyria. We're overthrowing our old bosses. Nabopolassar teams up with the next greatest nation, which was Media. Persia's not even on the map yet. Media and Babylon team up to destroy Nineveh, and things go on from there. Persia's a nobody. But eventually, there is this Persian king. There's a whole story behind it where they tried to have him killed off, and then they sent him away and pretended he was someone else, and then he finally shows up on the scene with great power, and this is Cyrus. And Cyrus the Great, he came and he essentially brought together Media and Persia. But because he himself was Persian, Persia rose up to become the powerful empire. And so people today, I'm sure many of us, right? If you think back to childhood and just stories, I mean, Persia, like that rings a bell. Media, right? I mean, like most of us, I don't remember learning about Media in high school, but Persia, that's a name that stands out to me. And so the horn that came up second became the greater horn. And it's the one that came up last. And so again, like here's just describing what took place. And it said in verse 4, the ram pushed westward, northward, and southward. Here is a new map. I found a better looking map of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, it's called the Achaemenid Empire. And again, some of these have different names, just depending on which scholar you're looking at and what time frames you're talking about. The Achaemenid Empire, that area down there in Kedar, they would never really take that out. They'd never make their way down there. And for what it's worth, it's like the desert, so I don't think they were too concerned about it. Remember the bear with the 3 ribs in its mouth? We talked about how the big red Achaemenid Empire would take out Lydia, King Croesus and all that, would take out Babylon, and they'd take out Egypt. And so pretty much that whole area, and even some of Kedar, they'd push those people southward, but that became the Medo-Persian Empire. One thing that they never did was move eastward. Persia proper, you can't really see it, but at the very bottom right of that map is the southernest red part. That is Persia proper. That is where Persia started, the birthplace of Persia. And from there, Media was to the north, so straight to the top. That's Media. They never head to the east. They only go westward. They would go to the south into Egypt, and they would attack a little bit more north. I think even a little bit more north than this map might show. But the point is here, as it says in verse 4, they went westward, northward, southward. They never went eastward. It describes the way they went. And when they conquered, no one could stop them. How big was the Medo-Persian army? We don't really know, because some of our ancient historians may have embellished a bit. Herodotus, who we quoted this morning, I've been quoting him a lot because he's a guy from this time period, and he was a historian, but he attributed their army to be over 2 million strong. Other scholars, I don't know what, these are modern scholars, they say it's probably closer to 200,000 or 300,000 strong. I don't know if they just don't like what Herodotus said, but it was supposed to be a huge army. He described it, and honestly, it's a good reminder. If any of you have watched that horrible movie, I know none of you have watched it because you're good Christians, you'd never watch bad movies, but that movie 300, and you watch in the movie where like Xerxes is attacking the Greeks, the Spartans at Thermopylae, and the sky is, that's taken from literature actually. Some of the theatrics, they were using really what ancient literature was. When the Persians came and shot their arrows, the sky darkened. I think it was Herodotus who said that. Might have been Xenophon, but it was one of those ancient historians saying they would shoot their arrows and the sky would go dark. because so many arrows were in the sky at once. They were an overwhelmingly large and powerful army. But they were stopped, which we'll see actually in Daniel 11. They'll talk a little bit about that attack on Thermopylae and the 300 Spartans and whatnot. And then after that came a great leader. Verse 5, out of nowhere, this male goat shows up, a he-goat, a unigoat. And he had this horn between his eyes. Well, that horn, as we learned back in verse 21, or up in verse 21, that's the king of Greece. Their first king, it's Alexander the Great. And he comes to fight against the ram. Notice how it says that he moves in such a way, verse 5, without touching the ground. It speaks of the speed of Alexander the Great. When we looked at the leopard, an already fast animal, in the vision of Daniel 7, he had those 4 wings. It's like he's flying into battle. Now, he attacks and he just kicks the butts of the Medo-Persian Empire. A little bit about Alexander the Great. He was born in 356 BC, son of Philip of Macedon. Alexander the Great was not Greek. He was a Macedonian. They were different. You know, today we don't think of Macedon, but they were on the north side of Greece, and they did unite to become the Grecian Empire under Alexander. And so his dad was just king of Macedon. He wasn't king over Greece. That said, Philip of Macedon, he conquered this one city and he named it after himself. He called it Philippi. So there's recognize the book of Philippians. It's named after Alexander's dad. So Philip of Macedon is murdered in 336 BC. Alexander is 20 years old. At 20 years old, he spends about 18 months, a year and a half, uniting Greece. Obviously, when your dad gets killed and you're only 20, other people are going to kind of like, I want to be the leader. I want to be the leader. And Alexander's like, no, I'm the leader. And he goes and just starts wiping out people and putting down rebellion. But by the age of 21, 18 months later, he marches on Persia. Okay? Now, Alexander the Great was something special. He really was. He was tutored by Aristotle. There are legends. I don't believe the legends, but people, back then were very superstitious. And the legends was that he was like immaculately conceived, that his mother actually had him with like a snake god, and he was the byproduct. And people feared him. Like there was this thing about Alexander. And so in 6 years, I'll put up this map. It's a little early because that's going to be the 4 kingdoms that come after. But in 6 years, he moves from Greece. He moves over into Asia Minor. From there, he goes along the coast and he defeats Persia twice. Alexander starts off with about 35,000 to 40,000 soldiers. He takes on the Persians, who have this gigantic army, and he just wipes the floor with them. He just annihilates them. They have superior numbers, superior everything, but the Greeks just come in and clean house. He moves down to Tyre. He goes through Tarsus and all that, down into Tyre. Ezekiel, there's some great prophecies on Tyre. We'll get there when we're in Ezekiel, but some really cool prophecies concerning Alexander's destruction of Tyre. He moves down to Gaza, takes out Philistia, and he moves into Jerusalem. And I've already told you this story, but as a good reminder, when he came into Jerusalem, the high priest, Jadus, I think was his name, he came out to meet Alexander. And what's fascinating is that Alexander was supposed to have a dream. The stories from Josephus go that Alexander had a dream of this high priest coming to meet with him. The high priest had a dream of meeting with Alex. When they get together, it's like they both knew they were supposed to meet each other. And the priest shows him Daniel chapter 8. And Daniel bows before the priest. And one of the generals asks, it's like, why did you bow before that man? He says, I didn't bow before that man. I bowed before his God, because he's the one. He was moved by this. And what's fascinating is that while all these other nations, he went through, he wiped out their stuff, he took out Jerusalem, he just kind of passed by. He didn't hurt anything. They, submitted to him, like, hey, you're the boss. We're not going to fight you. But he let Jerusalem go. And some people argue about this story, but they say they can't explain, though, his favorable treatment of Jerusalem for any other reason. He treated Jerusalem with favor that he did not show any other nation. So Alexander goes, within 6 years, he conquers all of Persia, all of Egypt, and within another 6 years, he's already conquered all the way down through India. By this point, it's less than that. We're 12 years in now. He's 32 years old. At this point, all the real known areas that he had known were conquered. He became a drunk. He would weep and wail that there was nothing left to conquer. And he ends up dying of fever in Babylon, probably tied into his drunkenness and some of the bad habits he'd picked up, June of 323 at 32 years old. So 32 years old, Alexander the Great passes on. And on his bed, we have from the writings of Lysimachus, who is one of his tutors, and I'm, again, re-quoting from last week, but Lysimachus, who's going to get the kingdom? And he says, let the strong take it. Well, that became a bit of a fight, right? It's kind of like when you tell the young men in the church, let the spiritual guy do the prayer, and they fight over it. No, but it's the idea is let the strong take it. So it took Alexander the Great 12 years to conquer the known world. It took his generals 22 years to squabble over how to divide it. Truly, it took 22 years of them fighting with each other. And really, Antigonus was one guy who finally got destroyed. He was the one really trying to take it all for himself. So the other four eventually bound together to defeat him. Once he was defeated, they divided it 4 ways. So again, as a review, but Cassander takes Greece, Macedon proper. Lysimachus, Alex's tutor, he took Thrace, which is on the north side of the sea, and then Asia Minor. Seleucus of the Seleucid Empire, he ends up taking pretty much Babylon, a lot of the Middle East, a lot of that whole section there. And Ptolemy, who was a classmate, schoolmate of Alexander, so these guys were his age, younger guys, he took Egypt, and he actually did conquer up in the Tarsus area, not Tarsus, but up in Tarsus, where Saul's from. There we go. Paul. He conquered a little bit up there while they were squabbling over land. He got some areas outside of Egypt. But anyway, these 4 generals came. And so you see in verse 22, the horn would break, and 4 that stood up in its place, or 4 kingdoms that shall rise out of that nation, but not with its power. These 4 nations would become major powers, but nothing like Alexander's kingdom. And really, the 2 that are going to be our center players for chapter 11 are the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire. So we'll be hearing about those guys in great detail in chapter 11. But that's our history lesson for some of the cool stuff that takes place in there. Now let's back up to verse 9, because there's more of the vision we haven't looked at yet, and this is where things maybe get a little more interesting. It says, out of the one, okay, so we're talking about there's 4 horns, so there's 4 empires now, and out of one of those 4 came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the hosts and some of the stars to the ground and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the hosts, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Oh, I'll go down to 14. And then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that one, certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. So here's the first thing, the most important thing for us to understand about this is that we have a little horn. And everyone's like, yeah, we've talked about the little horn before, but we haven't necessarily. Because this little horn is coming out of the 4 horns that came out of the goat. This little horn is coming out of that Grecian empire. This little horn, in a sense, would be coming out of the leopard. not out of the terrible beast with the 10 horns. This is a different little horn. And so we're going to tie them together, but what we're going to find is this is not the Antichrist, but it is. It's confusing because this is where the Bible sometimes has these types. This is going to be Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes. He is the son of Antiochus the Great, who happened to be the third. And history, if you talk to history scholars, Antiochus the Great, he's a big name. Epiphanes, not so much. If you're Jewish, it's a big name. But the son of this guy, he was the 8th ruler of the Seleucid Empire. So those guys up here, Seleucids, he is the 8th ruler from that empire. 8 steps down after Seleucid. The empire finally went 4 ways. 8 steps down, we have Antiochus Epiphanes ruling and reigning. Now, this guy, he gets to power truly by bribery and flattery. He wasn't really supposed to be the reigning ruler. His older brother, who should have been heir, was actually held hostage in Rome. Rome is on the scene by this point, but they haven't swept through the Mediterranean and into the Middle East yet. And so, but they're already a major power, and so they have him hostage. So Antiochus comes into power. What he ends up doing is he actually raises up forces and attacks and defeats, I want to say it's Ptolemy the Sixth, but it's the current Ptolemy Empire down in Egypt, and he tries to actually conquer Egypt, and then Rome basically tells him, don't mess with Egypt or you're messing with us. So he backs out of Egypt. He really hangs out most of his time there in the Fertile Crescent, the area of Palestine, the area of the Philistines and Israel and Tyre and Sidon. I mean, that whole area, bigger than just Israel. But he does for a while raise up troops and actually head into Mesopotamia. He conquers over there for a while. Why I'm mentioning all this? Well, if you want to learn about him, guys, and if you've never done it because you weren't Catholic, the Apocrypha. When the Septuagint was written, the LXX, you'll see in your Bible if you have those little notes, the Greek Old Testament. When the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was translated into Greek, they also translated other books, books that the Jews thought were super important, but weren't scripture. So when Christianity came on the scene and we're trying to make a Christian Bible, we've got the Jewish Bible. This is the Jewish Bible. We've got our Christian books. Here are the Christian books. But because the New Testament was in Greek, a lot of those Christians liked the Greek Old Testament because it was just translating and understanding and working with it. What about these extra books? Obviously, the rabbis thought they were important. So some of the churches accepted them. Some of the churches rejected them. The Catholic Bible still has the Apocrypha in it. But they were never Jewish scripture, and they were never considered scripture by the early church. But they're good books. They just might not be inspired books. Does that make sense? Just like when I quote Josephus or Herodotus or these ancient historians, we can learn from them, but it doesn't necessarily mean like this is scripture. Therefore, if it says it, it must be absolutely true. That said, the book of the Maccabees. There's 1st and 2nd Maccabees. There's more. But there's the 1st Maccabees talks all about Antiochus Epiphanes. So if you've ever read Maccabees, this name is really familiar to you. But if you haven't read it, you don't know the history. And I had a bunch of Maccabees quotes I thought about sharing, but I'm not going to. Regardless, it talks about him going into Egypt, him going into Mesopotamia. Well, look at here where it talks about how he was going to go to the south, Egypt, verse 9. He's going to go to the east, Mesopotamia, and toward the glorious land. And that's obviously speaking of Israel, that he was going to conquer and spend time in Israel. What this guy ends up doing is he comes to Israel and he wants them to be Greek, right? It's the Seleucid Empire, but he's descended from Alexander the Great's empire. We want Grecian Jews. And there was a lot of Jews who had accepted the Grecian Hellenistic culture. We see that in Acts chapter 6, where there's the Hellenistic Jews and the more hardcore Orthodox Jews not seeing eye to eye on how to distribute food, and they have to get the first deacons and whatnot. And so he wanted to make people just straight up Greek, though. Be done with Judaism. So he begins to ban Jewish practices. He closes down the temple. He sets up a statue, an idol of Jupiter. He sacrifices a pig in the temple. It gets much worse. I didn't want to write down all the wicked things he did, but it was to the point where he banned circumcision. If a child was found circumcised, the child would be hung, and after the child was killed, then the mother would be killed for allowing the child to be circumcised. Many Jews were boiled alive. There was just literally blood in the streets when this guy was there, because he was basically saying, we're done with Judaism, we're done with sacrifices, you're going to become Greek, no ifs, ands, or buts. I think in 1 Maccabees 5, it talks about how he went off to Mesopotamia. He picked a priest. So there was still going to be a temple, but he put his own priest in there to do his version of worship. And while he was away, like 1,000 people came together and kicked him out and tried to put a real Jewish priest back in. He came in. It says like he slaughtered 40 or 80,000. It was 80,000 were killed and 40,000 more died from something else. Again, big bloodbaths were taking place. And so he puts an end to sacrifices, which we read about here in like verse 11. He puts an end to the daily sacrifices. The sanctuary is getting cast down. This idea of the hosts of heaven is speaking of the people of Israel, that he's killing all these people. He's doing all this stuff. And it makes reference to 2,300 days there in verse 14. Now, truth be told, after reading a lot, there's no way to know exactly what these days refer to. Not because they don't have a specific fulfillment, it's because we lack the history. We don't have enough dates and historical information to be able to pinpoint things. If you want my best guess, because this has been translated and interpreted so many different ways. The word days there in verse 14 is a unique word. It's not yom, which is the word for day in Hebrew. It's actually boker erev, which will actually be kind of translated better in verse 26, the vision of the evenings and mornings. So, are we all ready for our first Hebrew lesson? I guess it's not our first. I keep talking Hebrew all the time. Okay, here we go. Everyone say boker tov. Boker tov. Okay, tov like mazel tov. It's like a good, it's celebrate. Boker tov, it's good morning. Erev tov. Erev tov is good evening. So this is 300 boker erevs. It's 300 morning evenings. Similar to Genesis, morning and evening was the first day. Morning and evening was the second day, the creation account. So some people think maybe it's not 2,300. Maybe it's 1,150, because it's like 2,300 morning and evenings only makes, 1,150 days. So some people do the math that way. I think this is talking days. It seems like it's just talking like specifically in Genesis. Morning and evening makes a day. The Seventh-day Adventists, they said that these are 2,300 years, and they believe that it was supposed to prophesy the second coming of Christ, and that's why they have a prophecy that he was supposed to have come in the late 1800s. I forget the date, but it's 1800 and something, towards the end, 1880 something. And then now he's ruling and reigning spiritually. He returned, but it was a spiritual return. That's a Seventh-day Adventist belief. Nowhere in the Bible do days equal years. There's days being 1,000 years as a symbolic prophetic thing that both early church Christians and the Jews believed in, but never days. This is something we can work with, though. December 25th, 19, I always want to say 19. December 25th, 165 BC, Christmas, 165 years before Christmas. Judas Maccabeus cleanses the temple. He comes, he cleanses the temple. I forget his real name. Judas, it's not, Maccabeus was the nickname he was given. It means the hammer. I love it. Who remembers there was a movie that came out probably like 20 years ago now, but it was The Hebrew Hammer or whatever. It was like a comedy movie, but that's what it is. Judas Maccabeus, it's the hammer. Judas the hammer. He comes in and lays the hammer down, cleanses the temple. The problem was that they started the menorah. They got the lights going in the temple, but then there was only enough oil for one day. and the process of purifying oil to make it holy, because again, they can't just use any oil. It has to be holy oil. It's an 8-day process. And so miraculously, the menorah stays lit for 8 days, and today we see Hanukkah still celebrated by the Jews. Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. We actually see it in the Gospels where he was going to celebrate Hanukkah. And so that's where Hanukkah comes in, is Antiochus Epiphanes desecrates the temple. Judas Maccabeus cleanses the temple. Now, where I say we don't have specific dates, if you back up 2,300 days from the day that Judas Maccabeus cleansed the temple, it takes you to September 6th of 171. History doesn't have a record of something specific on that day. There just is no record that we have. But that is ballpark about the time that Antiochus Epiphanes showed up. So possibly this is the 2,300 days. Why 2,300 days? It seems like this is from Antiochus Epiphanes shows up on the scene until Judas Maccabeus cleanses the temple. Bonus fact I didn't mention earlier. He took on the name Epiphanes because it means illustrious one. But the Jews quite often called him Epimanes. Instead of Epiphanes, they called him Epimanes because it means madman. It's one of those ones you have a funny name and people call you like, something else because, it kind of rhymes and whatnot. Now, we're going to start talking, we're going to keep going. There's some more text here to understand. But because it says in verse 15, in fact, I'll just read it down to 19 now. It happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard the man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me upright. It's like he passed out. And he said, look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be. All right, Pastor, are we talking about the end of Antiochus Epiphanes, or are we talking about like the end, like the end times? Yes. I mean, that's the whole point, is that this prophecy is about Antiochus Epiphanes. There's really no way around that. And yet, as we'll keep reading, it also seems to be about the Antichrist, as if Antiochus Epiphanes is truly a type of the Antichrist. So this is where I just want to make sure there's clarity here. Chapter 7 has a little horn coming out of Rome, coming out of the 10 horns. Tonight we'll finish up the 2 verses in chapter 9 we didn't finish. That is the Antichrist, no one but the Antichrist. Chapter 8 talks about Antiochus Epiphanes, but he's a type of the Antichrist. I believe Nero was a type of the Antichrist, someone whose actions, behavior, and maybe even his demonic empowerment was a foreshadowing of things to come. Listen to the words of John, the beloved, who wrote the book of Revelation, right? In chapter 2 of his first epistle, he says, little children, it is the last hour, as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming. There's a definite article. The Antichrist is coming. Even now, many Antichrists have come, by which we know that is the last hour. So this is the only place in the Bible, the epistle of John, 1 John, that the word Antichrist appears. But he has many names throughout the Bible. A human being who will be empowered by Satan in the end times. But what we find is that he's not the first human being that Satan himself has empowered. Was Hitler empowered by Satan? Can't say for sure. Wouldn't surprise me. The first Holocaust took out 1/3 of the Jewish population. About 6 million Jews are killed. Yet Zechariah speaks of a second Holocaust in which 2/3 of the Jewish population will be destroyed. There's been people throughout time who've had great persecution towards the Jews, great persecution towards God's people. We see Nero, and we see in the early church, who was it? Shepherd of Hermas? Someone, I think it was Shepherd of Hermas, who said that this beast we see is a picture of the beast that is to come. And he talks about how if you have faith and keep yourself clean, you shall escape him. Talks about the promise of us escaping the Antichrist. And so it's about the latter time. It's about the appointed time of the end. Which one? I think it's both. That's the catch. This is literally about Antiochus Epiphanes, but we're gleaning stuff now. It's like, well, that doesn't make sense. And you see this in the Bible. I know all of you are super excited when I get on my tangents, but Isaiah 14, there's a prophecy about Tyre. And then all of a sudden they start talking, wait a minute, that can't be about the king of Tyre. He's talking about Satan. Ezekiel 28, he's talking about Babylon, king of Babylon. And when you were in the Garden of Eden, you exalted yourself above, called you to be like the Most High. Wait a minute, that can't be king of Babylon. He was in the Garden of Eden. Somewhere along the line, he's talking about a human leader empowered by someone or something. And then these prophecies all of a sudden morph into it's talking about Satan himself. So we see this in the Bible. It's not an uncommon thing. So verse 23, we already looked at 20 to 22, which describes the Medo-Persians and the Grecians. So verse 23, I've already kind of explained it, but in the latter time of their kingdom, the four kingdoms, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive, and shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes, the Antichrist. We can talk about either one, but a verse specifically about the Antichrist says, the dragon, Satan, gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. It seems as if Antiochus Epiphanes was given power and authority. Someone gave this guy the ability to rise to such great power. Verse 25, it says, through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule. He shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. Again, this stuff sounds a lot like Revelation 13. It sounds a lot like other scriptures about the Antichrist, but it is Antiochus Epiphanes. And it seems to be about the Antichrist also. Where it says, verse 25, he shall destroy many in their prosperity. The word can be translated prosperity, peace, or calmness. And he's going to destroy them in it. It's like he's going to destroy them through it, i.e., somehow prosperity, peace, and calmness will actually be the means by which he destroys. It makes me think of Revelation chapter 6, verse 2, the first of the four horsemen. Behold, I looked and saw there was a rider on a white horse, right? And he goes out to conquer. He's got a bows with him, but he has no bows, but he has a quiver, arrows, no bow. It's the idea is like, it seems as if he's on a white horse, which kind of speaks of, I'm coming in peace, and here I am, but he's going out to conquer, and he has these arrows, but he doesn't have a bow, and it's like he's coming through diplomacy and speaking of peace and manipulation. He's going to rise against the Prince of Princes. I'll give you all three guesses who the Prince of Princes is. Everyone said Jesus in your heart. I know you did. So, he's going to rise against the Prince of Princes. He's against the Christ. That's anti-Christ. Once again, it's kind of in here. And he's going to be broken without human means. Well, Revelation 19 makes it pretty clear that the Lord is going to descend, and he's going to descend with his angels, and a sharp two-edged sword is going to come out of his mouth, and he's going to destroy his enemies. He's going to trot out the winepress. And so we see the destruction of the Antichrist at the Battle of Armageddon. It won't be by human means. Antiochus Epiphanes will die. He'll die out, I think in Babylon, actually. And it wasn't someone killing him. But it's just this interesting thing, this tie between these two people. Verse 26, the vision of the evenings and mornings, Erev and Boker, which was told is true. Therefore, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. Is it just 2,300 days in the future? Is it supposed to be something else? Daniel, I fainted, and I was sick for days. Afterward, I rose and went about the king's business, and I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. So he has this vision, and he doesn't know what's going on. It's confusing to him. Now, chapter 9 is years later. Chapter 9, he is 538 BC. He's now 82 years old. So he was 69 in chapter 8. He's 82 now. And this morning we got up to where this 69 weeks. We did the math. We did the math to the day that Jesus would ride in on the donkey. But verse 26 of chapter 9, just kind of tying in our Antichrist talk and Antiochus Epiphanes, kind of again together. It says, Messiah shall be cut off, but not from self. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Till the end of the war, desolations are determined. Now, Nicole and I were watching a drama show, detective-y kind of stuff, murder, right? And there was a line in it, and I told Nicole, I was like, I'm going to use that at church. Because he was talking about this other detective, and he said, I think that detective is more concerned about closing cases than he is actually catching criminals. I.e., you know what? That seems like the obvious killer. Just pin it on him, lock him up, throw away the key, call it a day, move on to the next case. Looks good when you close a lot of cases. But the main character, he wanted to catch the actual killer. I think a lot of people, when they've translated this text and other texts in Daniel, I think some scholars take the easy road. I'm not going to bore you. Some of you might not be bored, but with all the other theories concerning the 69 weeks of Daniel. But there are many people say this leads up to Jesus' baptism and the 3.5 years, because let me just read 26 and 7, then I'll come back here, because it says, we already read 26, 27, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. There's that 7-year period we talked about. But in the middle of the 7-year period, the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and awning. On the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. So some people say, well, this is Jesus, and the first 3.5 years was John the Baptist's ministry, and the second 3.5 years was Jesus' earthly ministry. Some say, no, it starts with Jesus' baptism. That's the 69 weeks. And it's 3.5 years of his ministry, but he's cut off. And the second 3.5 ministries, that's symbolic of the church age. And there's all these theories. For what it's worth, none of those theories have 173,880 days. They just take these as symbolic periods. This is going to be kind of symbolic to this time, and this will be symbolic to that time. Some people do the prophecy to Jesus' birth. I think some people are more concerned with just what seems to be a simple answer that makes us happy, and I can work with that. I think many people, when it comes to eschatology, end times, what's happening in the Bible, the rapture, the millennial kingdom. I've talked to people, and a good friend who has a different view, he told me, he's like, don't you think, should it really take charts and pictures to explain the end times? Talking about here's the rapture, here's the 7 years, here's the 3.5 year point, abomination, desolation, here's the great tribulation, here's the millennial. I go, you know what? Eschatology is like someone took the instructions to put together one of your children's toys, cut them into individual steps, and then mixed them all up and threw them out there. And maybe they inserted them in different books, because sometimes we don't even realize, oh, that's end times eschatology verse. Take that out. I go, sometimes you need that kind of stuff to understand, because it's not like there's one chapter which says, this is all eschatology, this is all the end times summarized. Chapter 7 would be the closest thing in Daniel, honestly. But we take out all these verses, and it might not be the easiest thing, but if I really want to catch the killer, I'm not just trying to close the case and say, well, this is the easiest way to understand it. No, I really want to know what the Bible's saying. I have to put these things together and figure out, well, it says that these have to go here. No, this verse says that would have to go there. It can be difficult. And there was years that I was a very knowledgeable Christian, knowing the Bible, and I did not take time to learn eschatology, because it was just like, man, that's a whole can of worms I don't even want to open. And it's okay to have that view. Like, I'm going to focus on apologetics concerning defending the faith. I'm going to focus on the gospel. I'm going to focus on, fighting the cults. And that's where I put my focus. Creation, eschatology was it's a big subject. And so as we look at this, people want to say in verse 26, that was my introduction. Now we're going to start the sermon. Verse 26, the people of the prince who is to come, they're like, he's going to bring an end to sacrifices. That's what it says, right? This person, he's going to bring an end to sacrifices or whatnot. Well, no. So the people of the prince who is to come, the people is the subject of the prince who is to come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Is that Jesus' people? Did Jesus' people destroy the city and the sanctuary? No. The Romans did. So now if we talk about whoever this prince who is to come, he somehow belongs to the Romans. This is where you start seeing this idea of a revived Roman Empire, of the feet of iron and clay, of the monstrous beast of Daniel 7 with the 10 horns. It pins it on some kind. I don't necessarily think it's going to be based out of Rome with the Pope or what, but some kind of a revival of the Roman Empire, because it's the people of him are going to come after this Messiah is cut off. And it talks about him, this person, the prince who is to come. He shall confirm a covenant with many for a week. Now, some people think, again, they say, well, this is Jesus. Jesus is going to confirm a 7-year covenant, and Jesus is going to bring an end to sacrifice because he's going to die on the cross. Yeah, I don't think you guys want to hear all my grammar stuff. But there is the antecedent grammar agreement or whatever. So he has to refer back to the most immediate subject. This is grammar 101. You never thought you'd use it. So he can't be Messiah the prince. He has to go back to the first single person pronoun here, which is the prince of the people who is to come. So the prince out of Rome is going to make a 1 or 7-year covenant. And at the 3.5-year mark, which lines up with Revelation 11 everywhere else, he's going to put an end to sacrifices, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. Now, many people pin this on Antiochus Epiphanes. They say, well, he came. He didn't really make a covenant, but he was there 7 years or so. He was there about that much time, and he did bring an end to sacrifices. And so many Jewish people, if you ask them, what is the abomination of death that creates desolation? The abomination, and we'll read about this more actually in chapter 11. What is it? Ask a Jewish person. They'll say, that was Antiochus Epiphanes, whom Judas the hammer put down. But Matthew 24, Jesus says, when you see the abomination that creates desolation, he speaks about it in the future tense. Now, I want to take a quick look at this because this is something, is just a closing thought and to help us have this eschatology in mind. Chapter 8 was like Antiochus Epiphanes, but it was also the Antichrist. That's kind of mind-boggling. Here's what's fascinating is that there are 3 chapters that you should be familiar with just if you're into end times eschatology. Luke 21, Matthew 24, and Mark 13, the one I don't have up there. Mark 13. This is something that you will find many people who are divided over, but I am a very convinced believer that Luke 21 and Matthew 24 are different discourses, different talks. I believe Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are what we call the Olivet Discourse. It was a conversation, a talk on the Mount of Olives. I believe that Luke 21 took place earlier that day. Luke 21 tells us that they're at the temple and Jesus is speaking to the multitudes. Mark 13 and Matthew 24 says that he left the temple, went up to the Mount of Olives, and then Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they show up and say, like, can you clarify some stuff? What do they want clarification on? I think they wanted clarification on his talk he gave in Luke. Now, in Luke, look at Luke 21, verse 20. It says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant, those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. They'll fall by the edge of the sword. They'll be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. He's warning the people. If you like really nerdy notes, Eusebius, book 3, chapter 5, verse 41, says that no Christians were killed in the destruction of Jerusalem. Hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of Jews are killed. At least hundreds of thousands, maybe not hundreds upon hundreds, but no Christians died. Why? Because they had a prophecy that said when you see Jerusalem get surrounded, you book it and you leave. So they did. But flip over to Matthew 24, because according to the Bible, after this talk, and there's a lot more, obviously, it says in Matthew 24, verse 3, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him saying privately. So this is disciples privately. Mark tells us, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, says, tell us when these things will be and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age. I think they heard the Luke 21 talk, and they're thinking, this must be the end of the world, Jesus. You just said that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. So Jesus says, well, if you want me to talk to you about the end of the age, I'll talk to you about the end of the age. Verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, that's you guys, let him understand. Then let him who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who's on the housetop not let him go down and take anything out of his house. Let him who's in the field not go back and get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing and babies in those days. That sounds a lot like Luke. Pray that your flight may not be written in the winter, on the Sabbath. For then there will be such great tribulation, such as not been seen since the beginning of the world. Until this time, no, never ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh should be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. And so he begins talking, I believe, about the end times. He talks about the false Christs and prophets they're going to show. Verse 24, false Christs, false prophets they're going to show you. There's the Antichrist and the false prophet who show up on the scene. And as lightning comes from the east to the west, so will this coming of the Son of Man be. So he's saying, man, that lightning's, when I show up, there's going to be no time to react. I only bring this up because just like in chapter 8, where we kind of have Antiochus, but we also have the Antichrist, here in Matthew, we see Luke gave a talk about the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome, but there's also going to be a similar scenario where people are going to want to flee from Jerusalem when this guy shows up. Notice that the key signal is not when you see Jerusalem surrounded. This one is verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation. And once again, if you want Joe's take on eschatology, that is kind of unique more to me. I believe in Revelation chapter 11, when we see the destruction of the two witnesses. There are two witnesses there in Jerusalem at the newly built third temple, and they are there prophesying and warning. I believe the Antichrist will show up. I believe he will pop a cap in those two guys. Boom, boom. Drop his gun really cool-like, right? And just walk right up into the temple. Because that's supposed to take place right at the 3.5-year mark. And I think he will. He'll be the savior of the world, because I think the world will be pinning the disasters of the tribulation on those two dudes. Because the two dudes keep saying, turn to Jesus or God's going to judge, and all of a sudden fire comes down. It's like, we're going to blame them for all our problems. And when the Antichrist kills them, it says the world celebrates in Revelation 11. The whole world celebrates over the death of these two guys. And I believe he will walk up into that temple and just be like, I am your savior. Worship me. And then this stuff kicks into gear. The Jews will have the light turn on. The Jewish people will realize we thought he was our savior, but he's not. He is a false Christ, a false Messiah. We need to book it and get out of here. And they're going to leave. Interestingly, in Revelation 13, it talks about when they flee from him that he'll send a flood. And we actually saw that wording back in Daniel 8, that there'll be a destruction and a flood. Connected? I don't know, maybe. Here's the catch, though. Here's the catch, is that I wanted to see, how do I tie this into the morning? And I did. It is simply this, guys. There was 173,880 days to the day that Jesus rode in. There is no prophecy that will tell us the date of the rapture of the church. There's no prophecy at all that can give us any inkling of a date. But there are warnings upon warnings upon warnings upon warnings that you know the signs of the times, that you understand the season of his return. I flipped away from Matthew 24, but I just flipped back because Jesus, they said, what is the sign of your coming? In verse 3, we already read it. Tell us what these things will be. What is the sign of your coming? Jesus said, take heed that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will deceive. When you hear of, verse 6, wars and rumors of wars, see that you're not troubled, because all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places, and all these are the beginning of sorrows. You know, you talk about, the Braxton Hicks we've been experiencing this last century. But when we start to see wars breaking out, trying to get out of Afghanistan, when you see pestilence, like a disease that throws the whole world off kilter, when you see famines, which honestly, COVID gets so much airtime that the swarms of locusts that plagued 2020 in the Middle East and Africa didn't get the screen time. And so you don't know about the upcoming famines that are truly like the World Health Organization and other people. They're saying like we're going to have some huge starvation issues going on in Africa and the Middle East because of what happened last year. And we're not quite there yet, but crops aren't being planted. So there's not going to be anything when the time normally would be there. Earthquakes. Haiti got hit again. Remember when COVID first, I don't know if anyone remembers, but there was a Salt Lake City earthquake when COVID first hit, and the main Mormon temple, Moroni lost his trumpet. I love that. That was good. But Jesus said to know the signs. On Jesus' birth, most of Jerusalem was clueless, yet some essentially pagan, maybe they weren't pagan because maybe they really took Daniel's words to heart, Magi from Babylon, they were watching, they were waiting, and they showed up with gifts for the king. They showed up ready to worship the king. No one else was watching, no one else was waiting, no one else was preparing. This is the kind of stuff as we look at prophecy and we look at the end times, it shouldn't make us news junkies. It shouldn't make us prophecy update junkies. It should make us Jesus junkies, where I realize it's just one more reminder. I need to be in the Word. I need to be in prayer. I need to be in fellowship. I need to be storing up riches in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroy, because, all this other stuff that it feels so important right now. Your job, your pursuits, your careers, your hobbies. Maybe it's not a hobby. Like your side hustle. There's so many things that seem so important. But like a thief in the night, the Lord will show, and it will dramatically change our priorities because time is out. My opportunity to serve him, my opportunity to pray for my lost loved ones, my opportunity to share with my lost loved ones, any opportunity to store up any rewards, it's done when he comes. And so as I see things like, man, Lord, this looks like you're close, it should just simply get me even more rooted in the most basic, simple truths that we all believe. Get in the Word, get in prayer, seek the Holy Spirit, stay in fellowship, keep on serving him. Do not grow weary while doing good, because if we do not lose hope, we're going to reap. And so those are the things that we need to be focusing on. So if anything, we walk away with, we have some head knowledge that hopefully creates a heart change that will be manifested by our actions in our daily lives. Let us now spend some time seeking the Lord.